Welcome to the Saturday night Promethean Action class. Tonight we're happy to be joined once again by Will Wirtz, who is a longtime associate of Lyndon LaRouche, a author of several books, including books on history and stopping the British Empire, and also the editor and translator of much of the works of Friedrich Schiller. He is the editor responsible for putting together 4 volumes of English translations of Friedrich Schiller's plays, poems, and essays, of which many of the translations he did himself, the others he edited. So it's quite appropriate to have him tonight. We planned this class several weeks ago because we thought it would be important to discuss the principle of tragedy and art as Lyndon LaRouche emphasized it. But it's even more important right now after this assassination of Charlie Kirk and its aftermath. Lyndon LaRouche stressed many times that you really can't understand current history as it's unfolding, except from the standpoint of great drama. And the great tragedians bring to the stage the great issues involved in world history and the emotions, the decisions, the dynamics involved in it. And as Will was pointing out to us before we opened it up, Charlie Kirk's death is not a tragedy. Tragedy, as he will present, is the tragic figure who fails to act to change history, who fails to make decisions, who lacks courage at the moment of decision, and the resulting disaster occurs. Shakespeare's plays, Schiller's plays all fulfill the tragedies. And the reason why these are important to us is not because they give us entertainment to watch the unfolding of a disaster, but they teach us how to avoid such disasters and the difference between a tragic and heroic figure. And I think just even in the few hours since Charlie Kirk's death, I think he can be seen not as a tragic figure, but as a heroic figure. But the real issue is whether or not the people of the world will meet that quality of heroism. And I can see from at least the outpouring of support around the world, they at least recognize that that's the issue. So it's very appropriate tonight for us to explore Schiller's tragedies with Will, who is a great expert on this and is studying them quite extensively. As I said, he translated several of them into English from German, and engage in a dialogue among ourselves so that we can become better equipped to understand and deal with what the current situation presents to us. So I think with that introduction, I'd just like to turn it over to Will, who will make a presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions, and there'll be ample time and opportunity to have as much discussion as we want. So Will, why don't you begin?
Okay, thank you very much, Bruce. And my greetings to everyone who is listening. As Bruce indicated, this class is occurring in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's brutal assassination. And as Bruce reported, I was saying before class began that his assassination is not tragic. In a certain sense, it brings up the issue which I developed in the previous class back in August on the beautiful and the sublime. Because the beautiful soul is one who loves and who does his duty joyfully. It becomes second nature to him, or rather, it becomes his very nature to love and to act to the advantage of others. And the sublime character, such as Joan of Arc, again, is not a tragic figure. She leads the French army in a war against the Venetian allied British forces, which were attempting to conquer France. And she dies through a frame-up judicial proceeding conducted by the enemy, not by independent judiciary, and she's burned at the stake. But she actually accomplishes her mission, and her mission was to fulfill the word of God, to do the work that he sent her to do. And in fact, through her efforts, we had the emergence of the first sovereign nation state in Europe, in France under Louis XI. And although that initial nation state did not actually survive as a sovereign nation state over the course of history, it was a model for others, including our United States of America, and a model for what the world must still become. A family of sovereign nation states united on the basis of the principle of truth and of love and of creative reason. So in that sense, I think we can already see that Charlie Kirk did not die in vain. And it's our responsibility to ensure that that is the case. They did not die in vain. And we must also take into consideration that he is not the only target of what can really be described as a civilization of death, which all human beings should be committed to combating. Of course, there were 2 assassination attempts against President Trump, then candidate President Trump, former President Trump. One of those alleged assassins is currently on trial in Florida. And we just recently saw the brutal murder of a Ukrainian woman in North Carolina while she was traveling innocently on public transportation. And of course, we look throughout the world and there's mass death, which is occurring. Not only in Ukraine, but let's take Ukraine as the leading example. I know that Charlie Kirk, as President Trump, has basically had a commitment to bringing about peace to that situation, where, as President Trump says, something in the range of 7,000 people are being murdered every day in a war which is endless. Now, as Bruce indicated, in a tragedy, what you have, according to Schiller, and this is also the case with Shakespeare, the figure, the hero in the play is actually tragic because for some reason the character does not act with love and does not act with reason to solve a problem which he's confronted with in society. And as a result, not only does he reach his demise, but there are tragic consequences for the society as a whole, and also for potentially for the world, not just the one nation. And Schiller wrote a number of tragedies. I'm going to address 3 of them. One was a trilogy called, based on the historical figure of Wallenstein, who led the Austrian forces in the 30 Years' War against the Swedes. Second one is Don Carlos, which takes place under the reign of Philip II of Spain during the revolt of the Netherlands. And the third is Mary Stuart, who was a potential Queen of England. She was actually, I believe, the great granddaughter of Henry VII. And she was jailed by Elizabeth for 19 years and then finally executed by Elizabeth, supposedly in order to eliminate the potential opposition and secure her throne. But in doing so, she brought about she led to the political demise of England as a whole. Now, this whole period that we're talking about is the period again of the 30 Years' War, of the revolt of the Netherlands. It is the period in which both the British East India Company is created in 1600, and the Dutch East India Company is created in 1602. That's what's being dealt with in these plays. And the interesting thing is that this entire period is a period of massive death throughout Europe, through religious warfare, and you also see the beginnings in this period of the emergence of these predatory East India companies, which became the leading edge of British and Dutch imperialism throughout the world. This entire period of the 30 Years' War and the revolt of the Netherlands actually ended in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. And at that Treaty of Westphalia, the only way that the killing ended was through the principle that one should act to the advantage of the other. It is the principle of love. And I would there's one further article, of the Treaty of Westphalia, which I'll read. It's Article 2. Quote, on both sides, all should be forever forgotten and forgiven. The fact that each and every one, from one side and the other, both before and during the war, committed insults, violent acts, hostilities, damages, and injuries without regard of persons or outcomes, should be completely put aside, so that everything whatever one could demand from another under his name will be forgotten to eternity. That's the principle of the Treaty of Westphalia, which brought about peace in Europe based on the principle of self-determination of nation states. It was a continuation of the principles of Nicholas of Cusa's work on the Peace of Faith, which he wrote in the early 1450s after the Turks had taken over Constantinople. And the basic point of his work was that since we are all created in the living image of the Creator, we're all capable of love and creative reason, then there's no reason why anyone should die because of religious disagreements. And that was the basis for the Treaty of Westphalia. Now, people like Tony Blair, back in, I believe, 1999, gave a speech in which he put forward the idea that we should abandon the principles of the Treaty of Westphalia. We should abandon the idea of national sovereignty and introduce a concept of so-called limited sovereignty. And that, in a certain sense, is the issue that's before us today in Ukraine and elsewhere throughout the world. Now, Schiller, I wanted to just read excerpts from Schiller's philosophical letters, because I think it brings to the fore the issue involved in the world today. Are we a civilization of death, declining birth rates, declining population, drug proliferation, criminality, warfare, perpetual warfare, endless wars, and austerity imposed upon the world's population by central banks, which have no regard for the populations, make no efforts to actually increase investment in real production, make credit available for that purpose. That's a culture of death. And this is what Schiller addresses. And the alternative to that is a civilization of love. Now, in the philosophical letters, Schiller makes this very clear. And I'll just quote from it. He says, "Love, therefore, the most beautiful phenomenon in the soul-filled creation, the omnipotent magnet in the spiritual world, the source of devotion and of the most sublime virtue. Love is only the reflection of this single original power. When I hate, so take I something for myself. When I love, so become I so much the richer by what I love. Forgiveness is the recovery of an alienated property. Hatred of man, a prolonged suicide. Egoism, the highest poverty of a created being. Egoism and love separate mankind into two highly dissimilar species, whose boundaries never flow into one another. Egoism erects its center in itself. Love aims at unity. Egoism is solitude. Love is the co-governing citizen of a blossoming free state. Egoism, a despot in a ravaged creation. Egoism sows for gratitude, love for ingratitude. Love gives, egoism lends. Love is the ladder whereby we climb aloft to divine likeness. Be perfect as our Father in heaven is perfect, says the founder of our belief. Weak humanity grew pale with that requirement. But this is the issue that's before us as a society today. I think it's, in a certain sense, it's an issue that comes to the fore with the assassination of Charlie Kirk. It's the question which is before us as individuals. It's the question that's before us as a nation, and it's the question that is before other nations as well throughout the world. Do we have the capacity to achieve unity based on love? Do we have the capacity to show respect for nation states, sovereign nation states throughout the world, but in order to promote the general welfare of the world's population as well as our own population? That's the fundamental issue. Now, when it comes to tragedy, I wanted to quote a few things from Lyndon LaRouche on the question of tragedy. He said, classical tragedy performs the indispensable function for a society of confronting society with its own propensity for bringing disaster upon itself. And he makes a point that what is necessary for human progress is to break the rules which have become prevalent and which are leading to the demise of one society. One has to not only break those rules, but one has to hypothesize a higher order, truthful hypothesis of the direction that society must go in. And that means bringing about a new set of rules or axioms. And we hear everybody talking about how we have to have a rules-based world and so forth and so on. But what are those rules? Those are the rules which have led society to its demise. What Lyndon LaRouche says in a book he wrote called The Earth's Next 50 Years is as follows. The great, often fatal error is to ignore the reality that the desired solutions exist only in discovering new principles which rightly, but also often abrasively, overturn most of everything which generally accepted opinion might have presently tended to agree to believe. Usually, unfortunately, the mistaken assumption has been made that the previous crisis was a product of the violation of some traditional set of values, when in fact it was caused by a failure to carry out a needed violation of that set of values. He continues, we must build a new edifice to supersede a sick world of today. Ask, therefore, what therefore should be the principles of design for an ecumenical system of cooperation among respectively sovereign nations, which shall deal appropriately with all the phases of design and construction to be accomplished on this planet during 2 generations immediately ahead. The good is never merely the negation of the bad. The good is the sublime, which has its own positive nature, working from outside the bounds of existing conventions of behavior, builds where conventional destroys by its inherent corruption. Now, what Schiller does, let me go through these 3 dramas. I think that's probably the best way to proceed at this point. Now, Wallenstein is a trilogy. It's actually 3 dramas. There's Wallenstein's Camp, there's the second one, which is called Piccolomini, and the third is the Death of Wallenstein. And Wallenstein had become the general of the Austrian Habsburg emperor in the 30 Years' War. But what he did is he toyed with the idea of trying to bring about a peace with the Swedes, and he merely toyed with this for a very, very long time, until at a certain point the Habsburg emperor decided that to condemn Wallenstein and to sentence him to death for treason for entertaining the idea of peace. Let me just read a few things that Wallenstein wrote. He said, war, not peace, is Austria's wish, and therefore, because I endeavored after peace, therefore I fall. So here you have Wallenstein attempting to bring about a peace to end this devastation. And it's the Austrian Habsburg emperor who's preventing him from doing that. And he knows that at the point in which he engages in a peace initiative, that he's going to be condemned for treason, and as happens at the end of the play, he's actually killed. Now, there's a let me just see if I can find it here. There's a soliloquy that Wallenstein gives, which gives you a sense of what it is he's up against. It's basically it's popular opinion and the belief in the way things are. It's like this is what he's actually afraid of. So let me read his soliloquy. Thou wouldst shake the tranquil, securely reigning power, which in deep-rooted, sanctified possession, in ancient custom rests firmly grounded, which to the people's pious childhood faith is fastened with 1,000 stubborn roots. This will not be a war of strength with strength. That fear I not. With any foe I'll venture, whom I can see and look into the eye, who, full of courage, kindles mine in turn. It is a foe invisible, whom I fear, who in the breast of man opposes me, by cowardly fear alone to be appalling, but not what proclaimed itself alive and forceful. It is dangerously terrible. 'Tis what's quite common. The eternal yesterday, what always was and always reappears. And tomorrow is good because today 'twas. For out of what is common is man made, and force of habit he doth call his nurse. Woe's him who moves his worthy ancient household effects, the precious heirlooms of his forebears. The year exerts a consecrating force. What's gray from age, that is to him divine. Be in possession, and thou dwellst in the right, and sacredly the crowd will guard it for thee. So this is what Wallenstein was really up against. It is this, you can, in a certain sense, the popular expression is a deep state. He's up against an empire but he's up against a mindset that operates within this belief structure, that nothing changes. That what was good yesterday is what defines what's good today. And now on the other, so this is his tragic failure is that he, at the moment of decision, he fails to act out of this fear of, very much as Shakespeare's Hamlet says, that what he fears is the undiscovered country, the unknown. But in this case, Wallenstein actually has some sense of what it is that he's up against, and its empire. Now, at the same time, you see what Schiller develops is that there's an alternative to this entropy, the entropy of popular opinion in this case, or what today we'd say is woke ideology, or all of the beliefs that we're led to believe are irrefutable. Human-induced climate change, central banking and the independence thereof, free trade as opposed to protective tariffs. You can just go through the list of the various ideological assumptions which we are told are no one has ever refuted. These are just facts of life that you have to accept. Now, but so that's the entropy of the situation. And if you remain in that geometry, not only will you be destroyed, but your society will be destroyed. Now, Wallenstein saw a greater potential. And so the audience looking at this play sees, well, here's a man who's basically being destroyed. He has potential to act differently, but he fails to do that. So I'll just give you a few indications of what he thought of. For instance, he said, "I hate the Jesuits. Could my will have determined it, they had been long ago expelled from the empire. Trust me, Mass book or Bible, 'tis all one to me." In other words, he's ecumenical. He doesn't, if it's a Protestant Bible, if it's a Catholic Mass book, it's all one to him. And so that would be the ecumenical basis that Nicholas and Kusa talked about in the Peace of Faith, and the Treaty of Westphalia put forward. And I already quoted from his statement about war, not peace, is Austria's wish, and therefore, because I endeavored peace, therefore I fall. Now, it's not inevitable that he should fall, but he doesn't actually come up with a solution about how we can bring about peace, even though that's his desire. And you see today, President Trump is committed to peace. But everybody else is in Europe, in particular, the Democratic Party, Republican neocons are committed to an endless war. Right? But a tragic end is not inevitable if you actually operate from the standpoint of creative reason and love. Now, there are a few other just indications of what the potential is with Wallenstein. For instance, Max, one of the characters in the play, says, he's talking, I believe, to his father, who's a general or a military official. It's you in Vienna who prevent this peace. And why? And you heap slander on Wallenstein. Why? Because he values Europe's welfare more than certain paltry hides of land, which may be gained or lost for Austria. You think of the issue of swapping land in Ukraine right now, where Zelensky, backed by the EU and by England and France, say no land to be swapped. You term him seditious and God knows what what more besides, because he spares the Saxons and attempts to foster confidence among our foes, which is the only way to peace when all is said and done. And then Max also, at a later point, makes the point that his father is actually what he's actually inclined to do at the point in which he can retire from this endless war is industrial development, creativity. He says, with his great drive for speaking about Wallenstein, for glorious creation, can he then unrestrainedly in retirement freely comply as prince? He can encourage all the arts and give protection to all worldly things, can build and plant and watch the stars above. Yes, if his daring power cannot rest, then he may battle with the elements, divert a river and blow up a rock, and clear an easy path for industry, and so forth. So this is what Schiller does, and Lyndon LaRouche discusses this as well. You have an entropic type, that is entropy, a type which winds down, because you're operating within the confines of a particular geometry. In this case, the Austrian Empire. And then there's an anti-entropic type, which is based upon the idea that man is created in the image of the creator. He has what's called capax Dei. He has the capacity because God has given him love and creative reason. That means he's in the image of the living. He's in the living image of the creator. So he has the capacity to act in a manner which is coherent with God's divine will. And if the figure in the tragedy instead of failing to act were to act, then you would not have a tragic ending. And that's so the person who goes into a theater and watches a Schiller tragedy or a Shakespeare tragedy, he sees, in a certain sense, he may see the weaknesses of the tragic figure also in himself and in others around him in society. And he'll come out of that theater basically saying, I'm not going to make the same mistakes as that person did. I see the results of such a course of action. And I'm going to act in a manner which is coherent with the divine will. And that's what's called the sublime. That's what Joan of Arc did. That's what Wilhelm Tell did in another play of Friedrich Schiller. Now, and this is something which the German poet Heine noted about Friedrich Schiller, that someone who goes into a play and experiences a play of Friedrich Schiller comes out transformed and is prepared to act. He's basically encouraged to take action in the real world to ensure that there's not a tragic result. And what Heine wrote about Schiller is, and this is in a book called The Romantic School. Schiller wrote for the grand ideas of the revolution. He raised the bastilles of the intellect. He helped to erect the temple of freedom, that colossal temple which shelters all nations like a single congregation of brothers. And he compared Schiller to Schiller's poems to Goethe's poems. And he said, Goethe's poems do not, like Schiller's, beget deeds. Deeds are the offsprings of words, but Goethe's pretty words are childless. Now, so that's what you've got. As I said, in the end, what happens is Wallenstein is actually killed by his own troops who refused to break from the emperor and from this popular opinion, this entropic popular opinion, prevailing zeitgeist, to put it in the German term, basically contemporary values, woke ideology. Now let me turn to Don Carlos. So Don Carlos is the prince. He's the son of Prince Philip II of Spain. Prince Philip II of Spain is also Habsburg. And in the play, there's Carlos has a childhood friend by the name of Roderick Posa, who became a Marquis. So his name is Marquis de Posa. And Marquis, so there's a revolt in the Netherlands against the Habsburg Spanish control of the Netherlands. And this went on for 80 years. So it's starting like in 1568 and ending in 1648, at the same time the 30 Years' War ends. And so de Posa's scheme is to get Don Carlos to go to the Netherlands and lead the revolt of the Netherlands against his own father. But the problem is Don Carlos is suffering from what the author Kubi wrote in The Right Distortion of the Creative Process. He's suffering from pretty severe emotional neurosis, because when his mother, Philip II's wife, died, Philip married the woman that had been betrothed to Carlos. So he's fixated on this wrong that was done to him by his father and being part of this royal family. And he can't throughout the entire play get over this problem. De Posa basically decides that he's going to address the king himself at a certain point, and then maybe De Posa can be the vehicle for liberating the Netherlands. And he gives a very inspiring speech to the king. There's a moment, all right, and in all of these plays, Schiller actually has in the play one of the actors say, "This is a decisive moment. Don't miss this opportunity." So De Posa is got an opportunity to speak with the king, and he decides to take advantage of it and address what he believes would be the conscience of the king. So he says to the king, "Sire, I just arrived from Flanders and Brabant, so many rich and blooming provinces. Then did I stumble on a pile of burnt men's bones." The king says, "Here blooms the bliss of citizens in ne'er beclouded peace, and such a peace I grant the Flemish people." Marquis, the cemetery's peace. You wish to plant for all eternity, and yet sow death. I shall repeat it. Give us back what you have taken from us. Thus become, among a million kings, a king. Become our model of truth and the eternal. One pen stroke from this hand of yours, and new the world will be created. Give to us the liberty of thought. So these are very striking. There's a very striking speech that Marquis de Posa makes to the king. But what Schiller writes in a document called Letters on, or basically a series of letters on Don Carlos, is that the problem is that even though he has these ideal notions, the Marquis de Posa is himself despotic. In other words, he has his own egoism, which prevents him from actually realizing these ideas. And as a result, what happens is it's a very complicated plot, so I'm not going to go through that. But the net result is that Marquis de Posa sacrifices his own life and gets shot while in prison, and tries to get Don Carlos, with Elizabeth the Queen blessing, to go to the Netherlands at the very last minute. But what happens is they arrest Don Carlos, and so he doesn't make that trip, to say the least. It's implied he's either imprisoned or he's going to be turned over to the Inquisition. So, as in the case of Austria, where you have the Austrian Empire, which is this fixed political geometry, which controls everything. In Spain at that point, it's also it's part of the Habsburgs, who are Austrian, but because Philip II's father was Charles V of Spain, became the Holy Roman Emperor. But it's also controlled by the Inquisition. And at one point, the Grand Inquisitor comes in, and he says he's been called in at the last moment by the king, as all of this has occurred. And what he says to the king is, if I had not stood before you by the living God, you would be standing before me tomorrow. So the king himself is controlled by the Grand Inquisitor in this situation. So what Schiller is showing is is that, in a certain sense, he's actually discussing the way in which you have today we have a bureaucracy in our government which is entrenched with what I would call British Tory agents, British agents of influence. They're popularly called the deep state, and they're deeply entrenched. But they're really reflecting the perspective of empire, of the rules-based order that the emperor, or the king in this case, Charles III, or Willem of the Netherlands, that they demand. Now, in so that's what you're dealing with here. And what Schiller is discussing. So you have to look at Don Carlos, and what is your conclusion? Well, you can't have an emotional fixation like Don Carlos. You can't being an egoist, believing that you can change Philip II, who's under the control of the Inquisitor. So you've got to actually have a perspective, as we did in the American Revolution, of mobilizing and educating the American population itself against King George. That's the perspective that you've got to have. At least that's the implied perspective, and that requires a creative solution. It requires an anti-entropic solution, which doesn't exist in the play except as a potential, as in the case of Wallenstein as well. Now, in Mary Stuart, you have a similar situation. I mentioned it earlier. This is not a play about Queen Elizabeth. This is a play about Mary Stuart. Mary Stuart admits in the course of the well, let me put it this way. She's imprisoned, as I indicated, I believe, for 19 years. She's accused of engaging in a plot to assassinate Elizabeth, which she was not guilty of. Others were plotting that, but she wasn't guilty of that. What she admitted to being guilty of was being unforgiving, and when she was young, being licentious in terms of relations. And there's a decisive scene where she asked to speak with Elizabeth. They'd never met each other, even though they were cousins. And Elizabeth agrees. They have a meeting, but what happens is Elizabeth, pushes her button and provokes her, and Mary blurts out that she wants revenge against Elizabeth, instead of remaining calm and actually operating on the basis of reason and love. But what happens with Elizabeth? Elizabeth doesn't want to take responsibility for the execution. So what she does, she takes an underling in the court. She gives him a signed statement authorizing the execution, but refuses to tell him that he should hand it over to the authorities who would implement the deed. And he pleads with her, please tell me, can't be my decision. This has to be, I'm following your orders. What are your orders? And she refuses, so that she can have plausible denial of actually killing a queen, because she had earlier been Queen of Scots, and she was a legitimate heir to the throne of England. So what you see here is Elizabeth. Elizabeth basically tries to gain the world and loses her soul. That's what she does. It's her pragmatism. Mary, because when she's about to be executed, she actually takes communion in the Catholic Mass. She confesses her sins, and she actually expresses forgiveness to those who were about to kill her. So she's actually a sublime figure, even though she doesn't act in the world to bring something significant about, like Joan of Arc. Passively, she's a sublime figure. But what you see is that Elizabeth has exposed herself as a pragmatist, as an opportunist who kills her opponent. Now, it should be pointed out that while all of this is going on in this period, and Mary was executed in 1587, so it's still in this period of the 30 Years' War and the revolt of the Netherlands. And the East India Companies of Netherlands and of England were created in 1602. In the case of Netherlands, 1600. Elizabeth dies in I believe 1603. So she one of her last acts is to create the British East India Company. Tony, could you just show the cover of Beware the British East India Company?
Yes, give me just a sec. There you go.
Okay, I wrote this book to really concretize what Lyndon LaRouche had really emphasized over decades. That what we're really up against is an Anglo-Dutch imperial system. And so this would be equivalent to what Schiller portrayed in his plays, the Austrian Habsburg Empire, the Inquisition, and Philip II, or Elizabeth, who consolidated her power by killing her cousin and lost her soul in the course of doing that. And these two, as I indicated, these two East India Companies were actually created in this period. In the revolt of the Netherlands, what Schiller actually makes the point, he says about Netherlands, the very time the Republic of Holland was still struggling for her existence, she advanced the borders of her territory across the ocean and quietly built up her East India thrones. So on the one hand, the Treaty of Westphalia has brought about peace. This is in 1648, about almost 50 years after these East India Companies were created. And it was based on a principle of self-determination, national sovereignty, advantage of the other. Basically, trying to create a civilization of love in which there was peace between different religions. But nonetheless, you have the seed crystals of that imperial system continuing, even while that those wars were being brought to an end in a peaceful solution. And that is what we're up against today, the Anglo-Dutch imperial system that emerged from the British and Dutch East India Companies. And those companies waged warfare against really the rest of the world, but it included India, which they reduced to a colony, deprived of its sovereignty, forced it to grow opium to ship to China. And of course, the British East India Company, along with the French, launched 2 opium wars against China, trying to force them to take opium, and even though it was banned by the Chinese emperor to do that. And Russia has always been the target of the British East India Company because Russia threatened the British Empire in India. Both Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and then Paul the First wanted to open up relations with India, sovereign India. And in the case of Paul I, he actually deployed troops to India to liberate India from the British East India Company, but then was assassinated by a British-linked palace guard in 1801. That was. Okay, so, but and you can see these battles depicted in here. We fought our American Revolution against the British East India Company. It was their tea that Boston Tea Party threw into the harbor in Boston, and they burnt our White House in the War of 1812. So, can you show the next slide, which is it just points to the last 4 chapters of the book. Point is, our society is completely divided. In the year 2018, I wrote something called The Way Forward in the USA. And it was based upon Lyndon LaRouche's 4 laws. The first being implementation of Glass-Steagall, something which the Republican Party platform in 2016 endorsed, and President Trump also endorsed Glass-Steagall during the 2016 campaign. The second is a return to national banking, which is a crucial element of the American system of economy. And third was, the credit extended by national banking should go to productive investment, and particularly into forms of energy production which have a higher energy flux density than solar panels and windmills, which President Trump is correctly moving against. We need nuclear power. We need fusion. And fourth, the idea of fusion power and a space program. We need to transform the Federal Reserve into a national banking system. And the third is the actual proposal of an ecumenical alliance between United States, Russia, India, and China to create a new Bretton Woods system. Because this is the anti-entropic creative solution to ensure that we as a nation and the rest of the world escape from this civilization of death, this cult of death, which is imposed upon us by the egoism of the Anglo-Dutch imperial system, like its predecessors. And the epilogue basically addresses the fact that because the Anglo-Dutch system has been in power since 1763 in the Treaty of Paris in that year, it has effectively ruled the world with few exceptions. And therefore, it's in our minds. It's in the minds of our leaders in one way or another. In a certain sense, less so in those who are advocating protective tariffs, who would like to eliminate the central banking, which violates the principle of sovereignty, and who disagree with climate, human-induced climate change. Those are elements of the common disease, which many nations are gripped by. And so, if those false axiomatic assumptions are not addressed and removed, and there isn't a higher hypothesis of what's required for humanity to survive and to flourish, then you have a tragic conclusion. So in a certain sense, these tragedies of Schiller are a paradigm we can learn from them in terms of what we are facing in the world today. And if we want to have a world in which those who are needlessly killed, including Charlie Kirk, who had the courage to go on campuses and engage in debate with young people, if we want to make sure that their sacrifices are not in vain, as Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address in respect to those who died in Gettysburg, that their deaths were not in vain, then we've got to actually learn from tragedy as I've discussed it today from the standpoint of Schiller, and free ourselves from the mental shackles of this Anglo-Dutch imperial system and work towards a solution which reflects the principles of the Treaty of Westphalia. That is, acting to the advantage of the other and acting on the basis of realizing that the principle of forgiveness. So I think that's really what I wanted to get across. We can discuss more in the discussion period, but that's the basic idea. So thank you for your attention.